Now we arrive at Alan Tate's highest example of poetic tension, Dante Alighieri. For Tate, Dante is not merely a great poet. He is the poet who achieves the most perfect union of extension and intention, of literal reality and figurative meaning. Let us see how. The passage comes from the Divine Comedy, specifically from the Inferno, in the Circle of Lust. The speaker is Francesca da Rimini, who explains where she was born. At first glance, the lines seem purely geographical. Francesca says that her town lies on the shore where the river Po flows into the sea. A literal reader might stop here and think that Dante is simply describing a location. But Tate argues that this is exactly where the genius of Dante begins. The key word is seguaci, meaning pursuers. On the literal level, the word refers to the tributaries that follow the river Po as it moves toward the sea. This is the level of extension, the actual physical landscape, the real river system, and the natural movement of water. Everything is concrete, logical, and perfectly clear. However, the same word simultaneously creates a figurative meaning. Francesca is speaking from the circle of lust, where souls are endlessly swept about by violent winds. The idea of pursuers suddenly suggests not only rivers chasing the sea but also desires chasing human beings. The physical movement of water becomes an image of uncontrolled passion. This is the level of intention. The literal geography and the spiritual condition of the damned souls merge into one experience. Notice that Dante does not abandon reality to create symbolism. The symbolism grows directly out of reality itself. The river remains a river. The landscape remains a landscape. Yet both naturally embody the spiritual meaning. This is exactly what Tate means by perfect tension. There is another remarkable feature. Listen to the repeated S sounds in the Italian words. Discede, pace, seguaci sui. These soft, hissing sounds imitate the movement of wind. On the literal level, they are simply sounds within the language. On the figurative level, they recreate the restless winds that torment the lustful souls. Thus, even the poem's sound structure participates in the union of extension and intention. The auditory effect and the spiritual meaning become inseparable. For Tate, this is the mark of great poetry. If we analyze the poem literally, it survives. If we analyze it symbolically, it survives. Neither reading destroys the other. Instead, each strengthens the other. The physical landscape becomes a revelation of spiritual truth, and the spiritual truth becomes visible through the physical landscape. That is why Tate calls Dante the pinnacle of poetic achievement. In weaker poetry, literal meaning and figurative meaning pull apart. In Dante, they become one unified structure. The geography, the imagery, the sound patterns, and the moral vision all work together as a single organism. So the key takeaway is this. Dante achieves perfect tension because every literal detail simultaneously carries figurative significance without ceasing to be literally true. For Alan Tate, this is not just successful poetry, it is the highest realization of what poetry can be. Now we have reached the final master mind map of Alan Tate's essay, Tension in Poetry. This diagram summarizes the entire theory in one visual structure. At the center stands the most important concept. Tension, the unity of meaning. According to Tate, the meaning of a poem is not found in logic alone, nor in emotion alone. It is found in the successful fusion of both. Everything in the essay revolves around two poles. On the left is extension, which represents pure logic, literal meaning, denotation, and rational structure. Extension asks, what do the words literally mean? It is the factual and analytical side of poetry. On the right is intention, which represents emotion, imagination, connotation, symbolism, and figurative meaning. Intention asks, what do the words suggest beyond their literal sense? It is the emotional and imaginative side of poetry. Tate argues that great poetry requires both poles working together. If one pole dominates and the other disappears, poetry fails. This creates two major fallacies. The first is the fallacy of mere denotation, shown on the left. Here the poem becomes all logic and no imagination. Everything is literal, rational, and analytical, but there is no poetic richness. Tate uses Abraham Cowley as an example. His poetry often pushes logical connections so far that the imagery becomes absurd. The poem remains logical but loses genuine poetic life. The second is the fallacy of communication, shown on the right. Here the poem becomes all emotion and no logical grounding. The poet attempts to communicate feelings directly without creating a coherent structure. Tate uses Edna St. Vincent Millay and James Thomson as examples. Their poetry may create emotional effects, but the literal meaning becomes confused or unstable. Thus, one fallacy suffers from too much logic. The other suffers from too much emotion. Neither achieves true poetic unity. To move toward balance, Tate identifies two poetic strategies. The first is the metaphysical strategy. This strategy begins with extension, logic, reason, and literal meaning, and pushes toward imagination and emotion. The poet starts from the concrete and moves toward the symbolic. This strategy is associated with the metaphysical poets, especially John Donne. The second is the symbolist strategy. This strategy begins with emotion, intuition, and symbolism and gradually moves toward order and rational structure. The poet starts from feeling and moves toward clarity. Although these strategies begin from opposite directions, both aim at the same destination, tension. The golden mean, the perfect balance between logic and imagination. At the bottom of the diagram we see the examples of perfect tension. The first is John Donne. In A Valediction, Forbidding Mourning, Donne compares the lovers' souls to gold beaten into thinness. Literally, gold can be stretched without breaking. Figuratively, love can expand without losing unity. The physical property of gold and the spiritual idea of love become one meaning. Extension and intention are perfectly fused. The second example is Dante Alighieri. In the Divine Comedy, Dante describes rivers flowing into the sea. Literally, he presents a real geographical landscape. Figuratively, the movement of rivers and the sounds of the language symbolize the restless winds of lust and spiritual damnation. Again, literal reality and symbolic meaning become inseparable. These examples represent the highest achievement of poetry. So, if you remember only one formula from Alan Tate, remember this: extension plus intention equals tension. Or, in simpler terms, logic plus emotion equals great poetry. Too much logic creates the fallacy of mere denotation. Too much emotion creates the fallacy of communication. Only when both are perfectly united do we achieve tension, which Tate considers the true meaning and ultimate goal of poetry. That is the central argument of Alan Tate's tension in poetry and one of the foundational ideas of new criticism. We have now reached the final revision slide of Alan Tate's essay, Tension in Poetry. This slide contains the most important facts and quotations that you should remember for examinations. Let us revise everything quickly. First, remember who Alan Tate was. Alan Tate was a Southern agrarian, a new critic, a poet, and a literary theorist. His essay Tension in Poetry became one of the foundational texts of new criticism because it teaches us to analyze the poem itself rather than focusing on biography, history, or the author's intentions. Now let us move to the central concept. The word tension is derived from two logical terms, extension and intention. Extension refers to the literal, logical, and denotative meaning of words. Intention refers to the figurative, emotional, symbolic, and connotative meaning of words. According to Tate, great poetry emerges when these two meanings are perfectly united. This unity is called tension. Next, remember the two major fallacies discussed in the essay. The first is the fallacy of communication. This occurs when a poem relies too heavily on emotion and tries to communicate feelings directly without sufficient logical structure. The result is emotional excess and weak literal grounding. The major example Tate discusses is Edna St. Vincent Millay. The second is the fallacy of mere denotation. This occurs when a poem becomes overly logical and analytical while neglecting imagination and emotional resonance. The result is dry, mechanical poetry. The major example Tate discusses is Abraham Cowley. Now remember the poets who successfully achieve perfect tension. The two most important examples are John Donne and Dante Alighieri. In Donne's poetry, physical reality and spiritual meaning become inseparable. In Dante's poetry, literal landscape and symbolic significance merge perfectly. For Tate, these poets demonstrate the highest level of poetic achievement. Now let us revise the three most important quotations. The first and most famous quotation is, "Greater than, the meaning of poetry is its tension, the full organized body of all the extension and intention that we can find in it." This quotation is the heart of the entire essay. It means that poetry gains meaning from the complete interaction of literal and figurative meanings. The second quotation is, "Greater than, mass language is the medium of communication." Here Tate criticizes propaganda and emotional manipulation. He argues that communication alone is not poetry. Poetry must organize emotion into a meaningful artistic structure. The third quotation is, "Good poetry can bear the closest literal examination of every phrase." This statement reveals Tate's new critical method. A great poem should survive close reading. If the poem collapses when examined literally, it is not successful poetry. So for examinations, remember this final formula. Extension equals literal meaning. Intention equals figurative meaning. Extension plus intention equals tension. Too much emotion equals fallacy of communication. Too much logic equals fallacy of mere denotation. Perfect tension equals Donne plus Dante. And finally, remember Tate's most important idea. The true meaning of poetry lies neither in logic alone nor emotion alone, but in their perfect and inseparable union. That single sentence captures the entire argument of Alan Tate's tension in poetry. As we conclude our study of Alan Tate's essay Tension in Poetry, we arrive at the central insight that unites every argument, example, and concept discussed throughout the essay. Tate's ultimate definition is simple yet profound. The meaning of poetry is its tension, the full organized body of all the extension and intention that we can find in it. This statement summarizes the entire essay. For Tate, the meaning of a poem is never located in a single interpretation. It is not found only in the literal meaning of words, nor is it found only in emotional associations and symbolic suggestions. Instead, poetic meaning emerges from the complete interaction of both. The poem becomes a unified structure in which logic and imagination, denotation and connotation, reason and feeling all work together. One important point must be understood here. Tension is not a compromise between logic and emotion. It is not a halfway point where each side gives up something. Rather, Tate sees tension as the simultaneous achievement of both extremes. A great poem reaches the highest possible level of literal precision while also reaching the highest possible level of emotional and symbolic richness. The poem does not weaken either side. It perfects both. That is why Tate admired poets like John Donne and Dante Alighieri. Their poetry remains completely logical under close examination, yet it also possesses immense emotional and figurative depth. The literal and the symbolic become inseparable. This is what Tate calls the highest form of poetic unity. Before finishing, there is one very important examination warning. Students often confuse the word intention with the common English word intention. These two words are completely different. Intention refers to what the author wanted or intended to say. New critics generally avoided discussing authorial intention. Intention, with an S, refers to the connotative, emotional, figurative, and symbolic meanings carried by words. In Tate's essay, intention has nothing to do with the author's personal purpose. It refers only to the rich associations and emotional meanings within the poem itself. This distinction is frequently asked in examinations, so remember it carefully. To summarize the entire essay in one formula, extension equals literal meaning. Intention equals figurative meaning. Extension plus intention equals tension. Tension equals the true meaning of poetry. Thus, Alan Tate's final message is that great poetry achieves a perfect unity where literal truth and imaginative richness reinforce each other, creating a complete and organized body of meaning. That unity is what he calls tension, and for Tate, it is the ultimate measure of poetic excellence.